Welcome to Irreconcilable, the divorce podcast brought to you by Sullivan Law Associates. We have with us our founding partner, Richard Sullivan.
Howdy.
Say hi, wave to the people.
Hi, everybody.
Rachel Bennett. She is a senior attorney with us at Sullivan Law Associates. She's been practicing for 12 years. Mm-hmm. We review that every single time I hop on. I need to remind myself. And you've been practicing for how long, Richard?
40-something, 48, 49?
49,
yeah.
50, 51. Okay.
A long time.
And my name is Matthew Sullivan. Yeah. I am the COO with Sullivan Law Associates and also host of Irreconcilable. And for those of you that are not listening in long form, you should. We are on Spotify and all of your social media channels where you can find a podcast. We are there. So find us long form if you can, please. Today's topic, it's a fun one, domestic violence. So people often associate domestic violence with just the physical abuse of it all. And of course, we know that is wrong. That is a thing, both in criminal and civil court. There are other components to it as well. And as you guys both know, it is pretty dramatic and emotionally charged, right? Going through the domestic violence process on either side, correct?
It is, as a whole, yes. Yeah.
And rightfully so. There's a lot going on with that.
Yeah.
So the first question that I have for the two of you, what is domestic violence? Does anyone want to take on this very broad topic to try and define it, label it?
Rachel, go ahead.
If you would like, I could, because I also have some notes on here.
Yeah, it's 6320 of the code.
Yes, this would not be irreconcilable unless Richard has set a code associated with whatever it is that we were talking about. Okay, so in California, domestic violence is not limited to just physical abuse. It can include threats, harassment, stalking, sexual assault, destruction of property, coercive control, which I know that we're going to hop into at some point, or other conduct that causes someone to reasonably fear harm or seriously disrupts their mental or emotional peace.
Emotional calm, I think it says.
I have in here peace, but calm and peace could probably be the same thing.
Probably, yes.
Similar enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
My emotional calm is upset just sitting here sometimes.
Sometimes it is.
I think about cases. I go, God.
Yes. So
my calm is upset.
So a very broad definition of which any act can fall into, more or less, right?
Right. Over the years, that definition has expanded and expanded. So the pendulum has swung, in my opinion, way to the left or right, somewhere off middle, because just about everything can disturb somebody's peace, emotional calm. You have somebody taking your parking spot, right? You pull into work, some guy's in your parking spot. So the relationship wouldn't give you rise to a DV, but
right.
Yeah.
Which is the next part of it, which is the law generally applies to when people are involved, such as spouses, former spouses, dating partners, former dating partners, people who live or previously lived together, people who share a child, or certain close family members.
Yeah, and there was a case where the person, he rented a room and she rented a room in the same house, but they didn't meet the definition of cohabitants, and therefore the DV was not available to her.
So, with the broad definition of domestic violence, obviously someone can allege something that fits this very broad definition, and there's a process that you need to go through. Who has the burden of proof for domestic violence to be found? So let's say something happens to a couple and they say, all right, I want a restraining order and I want to pursue a domestic violence action order. Yeah. What's next?
So for a domestic violence restraining order in the family court, the burden of proof is on the person who's seeking the restraining order. It's a much lower burden of proof compared to like a criminal matter. So it's weighed on the preponderance of the evidence. So is it more likely than not that some act of, by definition in the code, domestic abuse or domestic violence has occurred, compared to a criminal matter where, they have to have a higher standard of finding and,
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yep.
Yeah.
Unless they're prosecuting for like a misdemeanor battery or something like that. But those usually get pled out and, kind of reduced down. But in the family court, they're slightly easier to get based on that lower evidentiary burden. But the person who's seeking the restraining order has to prove that there was some kind of intimate partner violence or domestic abuse occurring within the relationship that would warrant the need for protective order.
So when does this cross over, or does it, when it goes from domestic violence to some criminal action? Is there ever a crossover there?
Oh, yeah.
Are there sometimes a crossover there?
All the
If
time.
so, what's the order of that?
Well, let's take a typical example. And I don't want to be gender one way or another, but let's say she got pushed by her husband. Her head hits the wall. She receives some bruising. Definitely physical domestic violence occurred. Okay. So one of the kids called the police. She calls the police. The cop shows up at the house, right? And those are the most dangerous things for peace officers, right? Yeah. Responding to domestic violence because of the emotional charge in the home at the time, typically. So what happens typically is that the cop would then, our peace officer, would issue an EPO, which is an emergency protective order. And that's a ticket, right? He writes out kind of a ticket, and he serves it on the person who committed the act, and he gives a copy to the victim, keeps a copy for himself, and that EPO is in place for 5 days, giving the victim, him or her, enough time to get to the courthouse and file a request for a DV order, kick-out order, stay-away order, custody of kid order, whatever. Okay, all kinds of orders you could get. So the victim would go into the courthouse with a declaration, and today it's done by email. Right. Everybody sends their declaration by email. Notice or no notice. I mean, we'll talk about that. Sometimes you give notice. I'm going into court that day, right? Mm-hmm. Before 10 o'clock that day, you get a phone call. You call the perpetrator of domestic violence. Say, hey, Bucko, I'm going into court, and tell him what we're asking for. I'm asking for a kick-out order. I'm asking for custody of the kids, exclusive use of the car, don't kick the dog, all kinds of stuff like that. And so then he or she has time to file a responsive declaration by way of email to the bench officer, the judge, who then reads the moving paper, the responding paper, and makes an order. Okay. And typically, there's restraining orders, I mean, if they're granted, but you can also ask for economic orders, like make the house payment, make the car payment, don't, transfer, sell, hypothecate community property, all of that stuff. And those are sometimes granted, sometimes they're not. But if the DV is filed with a DISO in the courthouse, those cases are combined. If they're not, you typically go to the domestic violence court itself, which is a bench officer, a judge, who only hears domestic violence day in and day out.
Wow.
That's all they do.
Wow.
So depending upon what side of the dance you're on, victim or perpetrator side, allegedly perpetrator, you can kind of maneuver to find the softest spot to land.
I see.
Because judges have a lot of discretion in granting or denying domestic violence cases. But, no judge, bench officer wants to have his or her picture in front of the,
right.
On the newspaper the next day saying, somebody was killed, some kid was harmed because the temporary order wasn't issued.
Right.
Typically, I think they rule in favor of let's be cautious,
right,
and keep these nut butts, these two, he and she apart. There's a lot of emotional going on now, so let's time out. 21 days 25 days at the longest, it should stay in existence.
Right.
Although it's a lot longer than that, a lot of times. Courts go, I find good cause to continue it. 3 months later, 6 months later, he or she has not had a hearing on the domestic violence case. They've had monitored visitation or no contact, kicked out of their home. And it's, it shouldn't be that way, but welcome to our broken system of family law.
So it's kind of like time out, everybody go to your corners until we can figure
sort
out
it
what's
out.
going on here.
Right.
And sometimes the court can get to you quickly, sometimes not. Rachel, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, that was pretty long.
Yeah, that was long-winded, but okay.
Sorry,
this is long form. We're okay.
In a
We're good.
nutshell. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
I
so
apologize.
the court had to come up with an imperfect system to fix an immediate problem,
Right.
right? And if the immediate need is for some level of protection, we're going to have a framework that works fairly well in circumstances where it's warranted and can be abused in circumstances where it's not warranted. But in every state and every law, there's always going to be kind of the fray of people who are going to abuse orders like this.
Sure.
And that's why good lawyers are necessary in a situation where there's maybe an improper restraining order filing or the process is dragging out too long. But by and far, if that comes at a cost of some people on the fray not getting the most expedited judicial process, but we're also protecting people who need immediate protection,
Right.
it works well for the people who are truly in need of it.
Right.
Right. So you get immediate orders for no contact, for move out, for no abuse. You're supposed to be in court within 21 to 25 days max to have a judge hear the whole situation, right? It in theory moves very quickly, and in some counties it does move that quickly. In other counties that maybe have fewer resources, it doesn't move that quickly.
Right.
And so there are repercussions for getting kind of caught in that process where if it's not totally necessary or if it's not maybe the best solution for what happened in your case, it can take a long time to right-side itself.
Right. And kind of like supply-demand issues here. I mean, if there's a lot of it's a large county, there's a lot of DV going on, you should theoretically have a lot of resources.
Yeah, we have
Going
one half
to-
the county circulating around the other half of the county right now, I think.
Yeah.
With all the orders that are given out there, there's
our
a lot
county
of them.
here, Orange County in Southern
Yeah.
California, it's a large
it is.
county. It's a very big county, and
It is.
there's a lot of family law needs, obviously,
Well,
and domestic violence maybe.
And your
being one of
your
the most
lawyer,
important ones.
and your lawyer, when people come in for consultation to their lawyer and say, hey, what's going to be involved? I mean, one of the things I often say, it's hard to go through a divorce when you're living in the same house, right? You're going to have hallway sex with one another. You know what that is.
We do. If you're a regular
So-
listener of the podcast, you know what that is, and you know what's coming
as you
next.
pass each other in the hallway, bad things are said.
Yes.
So you don't want to have that. So it would be important at the get-go that the lawyer tell the client, look, you got 2 kids, you got a house, you're both living in the house. It's going to be uncomfortable for you. It's going to be uncomfortable for the other spouse. It's going to be uncomfortable for the kids because they figure the fallout. They know what's going on here.
Right.
They're not stupid. And so what are we going to do about moving this case forward when it takes 6 months or a year and a half to get through with the divorce, and you guys are sitting in the same household? I mean, we have to think of solutions before that DV happens.
Right.
Because
Preemptively thinking
that's
through
right.
that.
The match is lit. It's just looking for the gasoline, and the damn thing's going to explode.
Right.
So let's talk about trying to resolve this. Or, client, wear a camera around your neck, I guess, because that sooner or later somebody's going to say something, and whether it's real or perceived, right? DV's coming your way, and you better be prepared.
Right.
Because they get frustrated. You get so frustrated, I got to get out of here. I got to do something to get rid of him or her because I don't want to come home from work. I can't sleep at night. The kids are upset. You have all of this drama in the household, and they should be reasonable adults about trying to resolve that issue.
I think they have meta glasses for that now. So you just wear glasses
They
with
do.
cameras on. So it doesn't have to be around
There
your
you go.
neck.
There you go.
But yes, it becomes It seems like it becomes a little bit more difficult if you're going through this process.
Sure.
If you're going through the divorce process and you are still living together in the same home, there's a chance for something like that to happen.
A high chance.
Or there's the other end of that where the DV sparks, the dissolution process too. So,
And some people plan it.
yeah.
Some people plan to push buttons and then record and then say, hey, look at this. Look what he or she did.
Yes, there could absolutely be nefarious conduct with trying to get some sort of upper hand in
Let
the
me show you a
process.
picture of my new girlfriend. Let me show you a picture of my new boyfriend. Oh, it was so good to be with them the other night. And then the other explodes, So there's all kinds of ways to push the button to make that happen. But,
You got to be smart enough not to react.
not to react to that.
So what is the point of what is it that people are seeking when they're going through the DV process? So it's obviously meant to try and protect somebody. What is it that they're seeking from the court?
Right. So what I would say a typical appropriate domestic violence situation where we are filing a well-justified restraining order request. The most obvious cases are where there's some occurrence of physical violence. And typically, if it's hit the level of physical abuse, it's not the first time that that's happened in the relationship, and it is something that has been building in a relationship pattern over quite some time. And the needs of a case in that situation are very unique because when you have lived in a relationship where the imbalance of power is so significant, there's a lot of deprogramming that has to happen on the lawyer side to really be able to help somebody get out of that abusive situation. Oftentimes when clients come to me and they've been physically abused multiple times, they have very few resources. They have very few options of leaving. They're afraid because they've been threatened to have their kids taken away, the house taken away, the money taken away. They're often isolated from their family. Their family usually doesn't know anything about what's going on. They're usually isolated from their friends, and they really have nothing and no one, and that's what they're really afraid of. And oftentimes, if it has hit that level of physical abuse, there's some level of convincing that has to happen on the lawyer side to say, look, you can't continue to live like this, right? And it usually has to escalate to the point where there's been some severe physical violence for them to be sitting in the chair, sitting next to me, talking to me about it. And so in that situation, we will do a lot of safety planning before we actually file. I want to make sure that my client is in a safe situation when the restraining order gets served on the other side. We want to make sure that we have full control over the scenario in which the service is happening because I want to make sure law enforcement is present to collect any firearms. I want to make sure an officer hands the restraining order to the restrained party and explains exactly what he or she is not to do and, where they're supposed to be and what they're, that there's no contact allowed and all of this stuff. And so there's a lot of heavy coordination that happens. We have to be very thoughtful in situations like that because if we are careless and kind of callous about it, that's when people get hurt. And that is typically the most dangerous period of time for a survivor of intimate partner violence when they initially leave and when they file for the restraining order. There's many, many cases, we've seen it all over the news, where she files for a restraining order, he walks right through it, and now we have a homicide situation.
Right.
So in true abuse scenarios, we have to handle it with gloves on because the stakes are really, really high.
Yeah. So are they seeking, is it a restraining order? Are they temporary? I mean, we talked about the temporary nature of it, like as it initially happens, and then they're trying to prolong, should that situation be serious enough to warrant that,
Right.
where there's an extended amount of time, and then does that become permanent at some point, or can it?
Yeah, so there's stages to it. So when you're filing, the initial filing, you're requesting a temporary or emergency restraining order. And that can only last for a maximum of 25 days. And if it goes longer than that, you're infringing on someone's due process rights because it's granted without a hearing. It's just granted on paper. Once you have your hearing, the hearing is for a judge to hear both sides' stories, look at the evidence, weigh whose testimony is most credible and whose story makes the most sense. And at that point, the judge will decide whether or not to issue, we call it a permanent domestic violence restraining order, but it's not permanent in the sense that it lasts forever. Right. It's permanent in the sense that it's not temporary, which makes a whole lot of sense, right?
There's usually an ending date, like 5 years, 3 years.
It has to be max 5 years, and then it can be renewed every 5 years
depending on what has transpired.
Into the future if it's necessary.
You can ask for permanent restraining order. If the ongoing conduct continues, the court will issue a permanent order if the conduct continues.
Or if the underlying conduct was severe enough.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
But it seems to be pretty rare. It's something that do they give the person found to have had been convicted, lack of a better term.
They're not convicted of domestic violence. They're found to be a perpetrator of domestic. Conviction is a criminal conviction, which could be, 240, 242, penal code, assault and battery,
Right.
So
those being found to be a perpetrator against or for domestic violence, it comes in stages.
Yeah.
It seems like it's a frequently visited.
Right. So the crossover, you're asking a crossover. So let's just assume the EPOs issued, the DVs issued, and the DA is out there because we have a victim, usually with physical injury. That's typically when the DV comes. I mean, goes to the DA's office. In other words, the cop makes a report. This is what happened. I interviewed the victim. She had a black eye, bloody nose, scratches. He then takes that report. It gets to the district attorney's office, and the DA, there's a plethora of those people that sit down, read the cop shop report, and they say, hey, I think this person should be prosecuted for a crime. So they could be prosecuted, and during the prosecution of the crime, the defendant, now called a defendant instead of the respondent, so to speak, has the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. The question becomes to the bench officer in family law court, let's see, this guy has a Fifth Amendment right so he doesn't have to testify. She has a right to get an order immediately, and she doesn't want to come back every 21 or 25 days to reissue the order. So what am I going to do? Am I going to say, Bucko, take the witness stand? If you want to take the fifth, I don't care. Take the fifth, because I'm going to interpret that as you kind of being found the perpetrator of domestic violence. Some judges take that approach. Other judges kick the can down the road and say, well, wait a minute, he's got a Fifth Amendment right, so I'm just going to continue the DV order until the criminal case is over. Problem there is that being an ex-criminal defense lawyer, what do you do as a criminal defense lawyer? You age a case as long as you can. Witnesses disappear. Minds forget, right, what happened, right? DAs change, and maybe you get a more lenient DA than the one you had. So maybe you get a more lenient judge than the hanging judge that you were going to get if you have to plead out. So you just age the case. So the two conflict with one another in that, and maybe the guy wants to get it over with. The defendant says, I want to see my kids, but I can't waive my DV because I might go to jail. So you have those conflicts all coming together when a DA makes a filing in criminal law. And that's the problem a lot of times. And a good lawyer needs to figure that out.
Right. I would have to imagine those are the more like severe domestic violence cases that is happening.
Yeah. I mean, you have injury. Anytime you have an injury, typically, even with a recanting victim that she's in the ER, right? Doctor says, how'd you get that black eye? Oh, I ran into the doorknob. Right. Doctor thinks, I'm calling this in. I'm going to report this.
And then the process starts.
Then the process starts.
All right. So what happens if you are found to have been found committed
The perpetrator of domestic
yes.
violence.
Yes. Don't want to use the wrong terminology here.
Yeah.
But
don't
if
do
you
that.
are
Don't do that.
you are found to have committed domestic violence, what happens? Like what's next? Like what happens with your kids? What happens with where you live? What happens with all of that?
Yeah. Well, the court's going to certainly remove you from any shared household. It's antithetical to a restraining order to allow people to continue to cohabit in a home together. So you're going to be removed from the home. If the court grants a permanent restraining order, you're going to have a overarching no contact with your ex. It's like an order to not abuse. So all of the actions that would fall under the definition of abuse or harassment or violence, all of that is prohibited, which is kind of like the most obvious. And then the courts, if there's children involved, the court has to issue custody and visitation orders as well. And the custody and visitation orders have to align with the restraining order. So if you have a full no contact, like 5-year restraining order, like you committed some pretty serious acts of physical violence, let's say the children were present or the children were involved in some way, it's highly likely that the court's going to look at that scenario and say, all right, well, you are not safe to be around these children. So I'm going to give the protected party, the other parent, sole legal, sole physical custody, either no visitation for some time while there's maybe some rehabilitative efforts, therapy, anger management, things like that, or supervised visitation. Oftentimes we see supervised visitation be with a professional monitor. That's somebody that is paid by the hour to watch you interact with your kids and make sure that you're behaving appropriately and not, behaving in a way that is harmful to the children.
That has a chilling effect on the kids.
Yeah. I've had cases where somebody threatened their wife with a gun and the kid was in the backseat of the car. I've had cases where, mom gets punched in the face repeatedly, thrown on the ground, and the child's sitting there in the living room watching it, right? Threats to the children themselves, right? So sometimes that is the most necessary thing for protection of the children. A lot of times it's a gray area, though, where there were maybe there were threats of violence or, acts of prior abuse that occurred outside of the presence of the children. And there's not been any allegation that this person was violent or threatening towards the children themselves. And then the court really has to look at that situation and say, okay, are the children in danger if they're left unsupervised? And it's not an easy question to ask because there's arguments on both sides, right? And the judge has to make the most protective order it can. And a lot of times I think we see a more stringent order occur at first. So maybe we see supervised visitation for 6 months to a year. And then the court says, okay, everybody come back in, say, 6 months. I want to hear from the visitation monitor. I want to know how it's going. Have there been any incidents where the children have been affected by this domestic violence? And if not, maybe we start loosening the reins in small increments to the point where eventually we're allowing this person to gain more contact with the children so that it doesn't affect them long term. But it is a slow transition if that is where it starts.
Let me just comment on that slow transition because we talked about custody before. California wants both parents to have continuous frequent contact. So now you have a domestic violence finding, okay? And let's assume the following scenario happens. Husband and wife get into verbal arguments. Cuss words are said. You're this, you're the bitch, you're the bastard, you're that. Kids are hearing all of this, okay? And it goes on, days, months. And finally, a dish is thrown or a push or a shove. And then one of them runs in for the domestic violence, okay? And they get it, on a temporary basis. Okay. And then they get it to our permanent. Well, you shoved her, and yeah, but we were both yelling at each other. We were both heated, and that's not unusual, right? But the protected person ran in first, and they got the order. So, maybe it wasn't that horrendous. Nobody got physically hurt, but technically there was violence. Something was thrown in their direction. He or she was afraid for their own safety. The children heard the yelling. Bingo, somebody's out of the house, and somebody's got, there's been a finding of domestic violence. So the perpetrator, the finding person that was found to be domestic violence, 52-week anger management program, right? Monitored visitation. Monitored visitation with the kids has a chilling effect on that relationship between, let's say, father and children, right? There's got to be a cop there. There has to be a person because we can't trust you. And then when the kids go back home, guess what? Mom's probably not going to support dad's relationship. Well, your dad was this or your dad was that, or, because she's winning, she's got the house, she's got the kids, she's got support, the highest amount she's ever going to get because there's no contact for those kids. So there's zero, percentage of custodial time. So that person pays the max for the longest period of time. So what incentive does that custodial parent sitting in that house have for this person who she doesn't like anymore, so she wants a divorce anymore, who's trying to get half of his property or her property? What incentive do they have to make sure these children have a relationship with that individual? Typically, not much. And what happens? As time goes on, that person becomes a favorite uncle for these kids, right? That's what happens. I mean, we don't want that to happen. And you would think a good parent would put those kids first and say, oh, yeah, your dad loves you. Yeah, he did this to us. He left us. He's not in the house anymore. He was a domestic violence person. But typically that doesn't happen in reality. Typically now it's used as a sword and not a shield anymore. And those kids usually
You're saying
go.
That's a typical scenario.
It's not unusual at all. It's not unusual
but it's
at all.
typical?
Yeah, I think it's pretty typical when there's finding of domestic violence. And let's get into the point. I just did a case where how do you rebut the presumption? What do you have to have? Once you're the perpetrator of domestic violence, what is it that you have to do to rebut that presumption, to have the court consider you to get those kids back, right? And you better be good, go through the anger management. You better not violate that order. You better do a parenting class, right? You better say mea culpa to this court. It's all my fault. I did this, right? And then the court will say, well, yeah, we're going to start you out with weekends, right? We're going to give you a little bone there. Still not being able to be a full parent of the children because of what's happened. And that, I don't think that's that unusual. You and I had cases where they reconcile. One case I had where the dad pulled a gun on the kid. Got him out of domestic. I can't believe that went my way.
Is the court being too protective? Is that what you're saying?
It can be. It doesn't seem.
It's typical of the court to be too protective in these situations.
Number one, yeah, it is. It is that way sometimes, especially if there's no. The law says violence against mom or the parent is violence against the kid if the kid's in the household, I think, right? Mm-hmm. So they can be up in their room studying, but there was violence in the home, so there's violence against the kid. And I get that. In the presence of the child. Who's present in the home, right? And maybe it's a one-time event, but there's the finding of domestic violence. It's going to take a good year to get through that process. That whole year with conflict and dad or the other parent having no contact with these kids other than a cop or a monitor sitting there, for a couple hours. What can you afford, right? So you can't go to the games, you can't go to school, you can't do any of that stuff because we're protecting these kids now.
So let's put you on the bench. Okay, that scenario happens. What is it that you would do differently to rectify that situation?
Well, number one, I'd want to have a hearing right away to hear from the other side. Hey, what did you do? How long is it? How long has this been going on? What did you do? How did the kids perceive it? And let me talk to those kids too. Let me see what they say. I used to be minors counsel, and it wasn't unusual that, once I'd ask them, "Why are you here?" Well, my mom and dad are getting a divorce. And how you doing? Well, I'm doing really well now because they're not together. I have peace in the house. The cop car's not coming around anymore. There's no yelling. There's no screaming, right? So when they get separate and apart, they can both be good parents. They don't have to alienate the child from one another, do they? They don't have to. But a lot of times they do because they're thinking of themselves.
Okay, so then in this situation, are you bringing dad back sooner?
I'd bring dad back in sooner and say, "Hey, how's it going? What are you doing? Let's maybe minors counsel to tell us how the children feel." Something to not make the balance of power now totally opposite or contrary to the best interests of these children who need a mom and a dad, that want mom and dad at the Little League game, the soccer game, back to school night. When you have these restraining orders, you can't come in 100 yards, right? So he doesn't get to portal. He doesn't get to see any of that. It's all done because maybe one time. It's all done. You can't have any contact.
So what's the restriction of the court for not doing that? Is it a time issue? Is it a resource issue? Is it being overprotective? I mean, you've been doing this for almost 50 years.
Well, I think it's I don't know how much training some bench officers have about child custody cases. I don't know. They have kids of their own. They have no kids.
So then they just go too far the other way. Just make sure that they. Okay.
They could, but a lot of common sense and experience with family matters. I think that helps the scenario. If you don't know what you're doing and you're sitting on the bench because the governor appointed you, because you have 5 years of being a lawyer, right? And you're sitting on there and you're calling the balls and strikes in these violent situations, right? The public sees us, the system in family law and in traffic court. That's when they see us, They don't see the civil cases, right, or necessarily the heavy criminal cases. They don't see how the sausage is being made there. They see it in family court, and it affects them personally.
Are they trying to keep themselves out of, headlines or because there have been plenty of situations that happen, not only within our own county but across the nation where something bad happens with a domestic violence issue, and either a spouse is harmed, children are harmed, and then the family case gets brought up, and then they're talking about the judge and what was done or what wasn't done, and then it has this effect across the family law landscape with how these things are.
Yeah, what happened?
Are done. Yeah.
What happened? Yeah, I've been in it.
Yeah,
I know.
So is that?
How come there's a dead person over there?
Yeah. And
who didn't see that coming?
Right. And sometimes you just can't see that. But has that made bench officers become more cautious? And are things being dealt differently because of how things are magnified in this way and the type of attention that's being paid?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sitting on the bench. I'm not in those meetings. I don't know.
Well, from your experience of doing this for almost 50 years, what is your opinion? I mean, you have a strong opinion about it. Why?
Okay. I wish we had, and I probably will get a lot of flack for this, but I think we need more training, more education on this whole dynamic of family and how these rules can backfire. What are the consequences of what we're doing? The unintended consequence of putting a percentage of, as you know, you only see your kid 5% of the time, so you're going to pay all that child support. So parents are fighting over money, not the kid, and the consequences of, okay, we got to make everybody safe, but what is the backdrop on that? What is the consequence of that? Unintended consequence. I get it.
Sure.
But it happens. They become favorite uncles. They lose a mom, they lose a dad. And that's what happens a lot of times. And a lot of times it happens because I see it. And nothing I can do about it.
Right.
I try. I tell them, this is what I'm seeing, Judge. But, when a kid is 13 and you say, oh, we're going to see a therapist, reunification, the kid and dad. Okay, you get 1 hour with the therapist and you get 2 weeks before you see the therapist again in a household that doesn't support that relationship, guess what happens? Nothing. No reconciliation. No movement towards healing that problem. Not at all. And it won't happen. 13, 14, 15, 16, they don't want to be with either parent by that time. Give me the keys to the car and some money, right? So that parent has kind of lost touch. Unintended consequences.
Sure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, protection is also needed for
I understand.
So
I understand.
It's
within reason.
Yeah, it seems to be a balancing act, and it's up to a jury of one to
and you have
that.
a jury of one, and you have a bench officer that has 10 cases a day.
Right.
And they open up at 8:30 and they shut down at 4:15, and they take an hour and a half lunch, and they get a 15-minute break in the morning and the afternoon. So figure that out.
Not enough resources is kind of what I'm hearing.
That's true.
Time and resources.
Yeah.
And a lot of cases to see.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this issue is so deeply nuanced.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because we've seen certainly the cases that the underlying incident was not severe enough to warrant all of the future consequences.
We had that case, remember?
Absolutely.
We had that case
Absolutely.
together.
And there's and those are not highly uncommon cases.
They're not.
They're not.
Yeah.
There's also, it's not highly uncommon for there to be very severe underlying incidents.
Yeah.
Where the future consequences are well warranted. Right.
I agree. Totally agree with that.
It's also, it's shitty for both parents, right? To be the person who was the recipient of the abuse, to now be put into the position where you are the sole caretaker of the children, you are the keeper of the children's safety. In scenarios where there was a lot of verbal abuse in the home, trying to make a good decision about what level of contact is healthy for our children to be around this person who is so inextricably angry about the scenario that they cannot even be around the children without saying horrible, nasty, negative things or bringing the children into the conflict, right?
Right.
Or, even worse if they were abusive towards the children. At what point is it appropriate to bring them back into the children's lives? And, I'll always advocate for some kind of reunification as long as it's healthy and safe for the children. But there's no bright line, this is, you've arrived at the point in which it is appropriate, right? It's always nuanced. It's always really, really difficult to gauge. But that's where good advocacy comes in. That's where hopefully, thoughtful judge, consideration and judicial training is really important, because it's a situation where it may feel like a flash in the pan, and then all of these future consequences come out of it for years and years and years. I think maybe the biggest takeaway here is if you have maybe a propensity towards anger or violence or abusive conduct in some way, catch yourself and go and get some help, go get some therapy. Just understand how deeply horrific the effects of that behavior will be on you and your spouse and your children's futures, your financial futures, right? There are serious consequences. And so if you are concerned that you might cross the line, and maybe you find yourself in a scenario where it's not the worst situation in the world, it's not the most egregious act of domestic violence, but maybe it counts under the definition on the code, think about that before you do the shove or before you start the argument.
Kids learn by watching you. You're the model.
Right.
They don't care what you say, but they watch what you do. They watch how you do it. If you get your wife's chair and get her a flower every now and then, hold her door open, say I love you, be affectionate, that's the kind of modeling you want. Mm-hmm. You don't want the modeling when you come home from work and it's F you and up yours and you bastard or you bitch, and your children hear this day in and day out. That's where it all falls apart, and those kids are going to be just like mom and dad. I'm going to pick out somebody just like dad. I pick out somebody just like mom, and we're going to act just like 11-year-olds when we have our kids, because that's what we've been told, trained to do. So that's the problem in the household. And does the government step in and fix that? I don't know. I mean, usually when a government steps in and does anything, it's a cluster. So good lawyers in family law solve problems. Don't go to the government with he or she in a black dress on a high bench to tell you how to run your life or raise your kids, because that ain't going to work for y'all. Go to somebody who has some common sense, life experience to resolve your differences. Grow up, figure it out, because once you go to the government, you're going to get what government gives you.
Well,
the broad stroke brush.
Yeah, if anything, I think the PSA here is to know what's the final result of actions that maybe you shouldn't have taken, or putting yourself in a situation that could lead to all of these types of consequences.
But those people have seen it. That's how they are. That's why they're there. Typically, you ask them, how did you grow up? Well, we had domestic violence in my household. Mom was subservient, dad was the boss. This is how it was. That's what I'm going to do. And as it just perpetuates itself, that's the way it is. Speaking about females and domestic violence, they go back to the perpetrator 7 times before they decide to do something about it. 7 times, because he usually says, well, it's your fault. Well, I'm sorry, or whatever, But yeah, it's hard for them to get out of it a lot of times. I get that.
Yeah. So I mean, if you can be the person that stops the cycle, great.
Yeah.
I mean, if this podcast is, the reason why you think twice about maybe overreacting to any situation that would, cause you to commit domestic violence, then awesome. Like, that would be great to stop the cycle, or just to know what the next steps are should you do that. This is what your future might look like in an imperfect system. You're leaving it up to somebody else to make a judgment call on how your life is going to proceed for the next foreseeable future.
And your kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing you love the most, right? Your children. They love you too.
Yeah.
Don't put it on them.
So if anything can be taken away from this episode, wherever it is that you stand on these issues, just know that the system obviously is not perfect, and it's trying to do the best it can to protect everyone that's involved. We think.
It's trying to do the best. There's no doubt they care.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they don't. They, being the bench officer, cares, and they want to do a good job. Do they have the resources and the time? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let that be your takeaway for the day. If this is what you listen to start your day, heavy topic to start on, but very important one, and obviously a very nuanced one. But thank you for joining us here today on episode 16, where we went over domestic violence. So follow us on all of our socials to get more information just like this, and hopefully this was helpful. Thank you both.